It has started recording and I'm waiting for the go. Just smiling. We are online now. Welcome to the TITBIT studio. Welcome to a lunch with us today, this very rainy and gray Tuesday, at least here in Copenhagen and also in Lund, where our speaker of today is located. So today we are gonna have a little of a tasting of what is the taste of human error. Well, human error, I think we all know that the taste can be bitter or shameful. I could also mention a lot of other words about what the taste could be or the feeling could be, but this is actually what Johan is going to dive into today, because he is a researcher at Lund University. He's actually an associate professor, Johan Bergström, and he's very much into the safety of aviation. But of course, as we all know, aviation is very much like the shipping field where we are. So you can do a lot of good knowledge transfer from these two sectors. As you see, Johan, he is surrounded by all his books and also a couple of planes on his bookshelf behind him. So let's get started with this tidbits. We only have 30 seconds. That's the concept. It's short and sweet. So it's around 15 minutes of talk with Johan, and then it's followed by a 15 minutes Q&A afterwards. So if you feel to ask any question, just put them in the chat or in the Q&A function, and afterwards we will read up these questions to Johan, and you will get all your questions answered. Another thing is that this tidbit concept, it allows you to enjoy your lunch home or in the office. We are more or less back in the offices now. So please just prepare a nice lunch plate for you. Or if you feel to miss out doing some push-ups or stretching, this can be digested together with today's tidbit. So it's cozy, so just lean back, relax, and enjoy that we are here with very cozy backgrounds, no blurred backgrounds or logo backgrounds. We don't like that. We like that it's more familiar and cozy home style studio here. So let's get started. We will have a cheers in our Royal Copenhagen cups today, Johan.
We will indeed.
Cheers for a great and inspiring tidbit today. Johan Bergström, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that kind introduction and for the invitation to come here and share some thoughts today about human error as an analytical construct in accident investigations in particular. You asked what does human error taste like here as this lunch menu, and I think that what I will offer at one point in this presentation is that we actually go to a different restaurant, but let's not jump ahead too much. I think what we need to do here is to establish first, what does human error in accident investigation typically look like? What terms are used to hide the notion of human error in there between the lines? So I will start with an example of that, and then try to deconstruct that just ever so slightly to then suggest a different approach to accident investigation and accident analysis. But let's start with this example. And this is not to point out any accident investigation board in particular. This is just an example. It's actually 10 years old now. So just take this as an example of what human error typically looks like in accident investigation. And this is accident investigation at sea. The study of a collision between the fishing vessel Homeland and the ro-ro vessel Scottish Viking, as I said, 10 years ago, in which this accident investigation board concludes that Scottish Viking's second officer showed a poor attitude towards guidance and regulation. He lacked precautionary thought. He failed to appreciate the hazard he was creating by intentionally navigating in close proximity to other vessels. What is it that we see here? the lacking of precautionary thought, the intentional act to navigate in close proximity to other vessels, the poor attitude, the morally flawed operator of, in this case, the ro-ro vessel Scottish Viking. And this is not an unusual kind of statement for the accident analysis that approaches humans as a problem in inherently safe systems. That is the assumption that we make. And I will outline that assumption now together with some other. Human error as an analytical conclusion typically focuses on a choice to do right or wrong, and the choice to, in the specific case, act wrongly. A moral choice, if you like, and ultimately a moral failure. Perhaps best pictured by the pictures that we all know also 10 years ago soon, Captain Francesco Schettino, Captain Coward, the chicken of the sea, who not only intentionally, back to the choice, intentionally navigated close to shoreline as a show, but also intentionally choosing, which shows again his moral failure, choosing to abandon his ship ahead of many of the passengers. The perfect moral monster of the human error story, if you like. Based on reductionism, human error as an analytical conclusion is based on a reductionist idea of how systems work. The reductionist idea of how systems work is to say that the functioning of the whole can be understood and analyzed as the functioning of the constituent components. Essentially, that the whole system works as long as all the components work. And if the whole system is not working, that's because there is a component somewhere that is not working. In this case, a morally flawed human component. And if it wasn't for those morally flawed, unreliable human beings, the system would have been safe. The system is inherently safe. We've designed the safe system. If only humans could choose not to err. If only humans could choose to do the right thing, to make the morally correct choices, the system would be inherently safe. And when it isn't, we attribute the causes of accidents to human error. That's the menu offered in this human error TITBIT lunch. What about going to a different restaurant, as I said? What happens if we reject all these assumptions? What additional theory for how failure emerges could we formulate instead? What happens if we reject all these assumptions about human error? First of all, we would need a new set of assumptions, and then we will need new means to draw conclusions in the wake of accidents. But the new assumptions that I will suggest in this short introduction to the topic would be, first of all, the assumption that human error will always be an ex post facto construction of cause. Human error will always remain a claim made in hindsight when knowing the outcome of an event. I think these two dudes picture that so well, and this is a picture that is almost 20 years old now, reflecting on the Bali bombings, where one of these guys say, it was so obvious that this Bali bombing was going to happen. I can't believe the government didn't foresee it. Just can't believe it. All right, says the other, where do you think the next one might be then? The next one won't be so predictable. That's obvious. Anyone can see that. The idea that I totally saw what was coming, but what will come is not so predictable. But I totally saw that this one, which just happened, would happen. Hindsight bias, we call that. The human tendency to reconstruct our own sense of, or our own ability to estimate probabilities based on reconstructing our own perception of the probability of something happening which just happened, right? Hindsight bias is what we call that. And with this sort of, from this perspective that we now try to do away with human error as an analytical conclusion and as an analytical tool, then one of the first statements and assumptions that we make is to say human error will always remain a claim made in hindsight. It doesn't say anything about what was locally rational for people to do in the moment they did it. So this is the next assumption that becomes important, the assumption of local rationality, that people do what is locally rational at the time. At the time, it is not an error, because then they wouldn't do it. At the time, they do what is locally rational to them based on their experiences, expectations, and perceptions of the current state of events. The next assumption is that the system is not inherently safe. The system is continuously kept safe by people's continuous adaptation strategies. People continuously create safety in systems that are typically quite unforgiving, uncertain, complex, and risky. And in those situations, people guarantee safety. People represent a resource to harness rather than a problem to control, as some of our colleagues would put it. And we also, from these new assumptions, recognize that while people have agency and choice, their degrees of freedom will always be limited. They are not self-contained individuals with perfect control over the state of events and the cause-effect relationships of their systems. Their degrees of freedom, their possible actions to take, their possible adaptation strategies to use will always be limited. And accidents do not happen in morally flawed people's choices and wrongdoings and violations. Accidents happen in interactions and relations between people and their technological tools, between people and hierarchical levels, and over time. So accidents happen in interactions and relations rather than within any individual actors. Then we cannot reduce the functioning of the whole to the functioning of the constituent components, but only understand the functioning of the whole as an emergent property of the relations and interactions going on in the system. And this we call not reductionism, this we call holism. So the new assumptions that I've just laid out are based on a holistic approach to the analysis of accidents, rather than a reductionistic that we saw with using human error as an analytical construct and conclusion. So those are our new assumptions. Rejecting human error as a viable analytical construct in accident analysis. Then what? What do we do with these assumptions? How do we transfer these assumptions into an approach to accident analysis? And I'll share some thoughts about that briefly. Then what we need to do is, in our accident analysis efforts, open up the dimensions of time and space, describe local rationality rather than one correct picture of the state of events, make recommendations targeting the conditions under which people work, and analyze how people create safety every single day at work. And I will go through these one by one so you sort of understand what I mean. One of the best examples, I think, of an analysis opening up the dimensions of time and space is this one. And I don't have time to go into the case in detail, but I encourage all of you to check this book out. Scott Snook's The Friendly Fire, The Accidental Shootdown of US Black Hawks over Northern Iraq, published in the year 2000, based on a case that happened in 1994, involving the American armed forces or battle force situated in Iraq at the time, a time which was not in peace and not in war. This was following the first Iraq invasion and between the first and the second, so to speak. And what happened this day in 1994 over northern Iraq is that two of the American Air Force's F-15 fighter jets caught up with two of the armies, its own armies, Black Hawk helicopters on a transport mission, and shot them down. In clear sky, with plenty of time, they shot down their own friends. And Scott Snook, the author of this book and the author of a PhD thesis, which this book is based on, he struggled with this case. And what he ultimately did, rather than attributing this case to a perverse desire to shoot by some F-15 pilots, he opened up the dimensions of time and space. And this is the causal map that he draws. And he says, in order to understand the accidental shoot down that happened here, close in time and space, or right at the accident scene in time and space, what I now will do is to open up the dimension of time. He calls it the proximity to accident in this chart. And then on the x-axis here, we have time. And then opening up the dimensions of time and space, he shows the messy causal relationships between various factors and hierarchies over time that ultimately led to two F-15 pilots misidentifying friends as enemies, shooting them down. And he says, in order to understand this now, based on my causal map, I can draw the conclusion that in order to understand what happens down here in 1994, we need to go back all the way to up there at the highest point, furthest away from in time and space, to the fall of the Soviet Union. So talk to me about the cause of how this friendly fire accident happened. Well, let me talk about how this started with the fall of the Soviet Union, Scott Snook says. I think that is a very interesting approach to take. And here's a different case. I've mentioned it already. This is an extract from an email. This is an extract from an email which was sent in August 2011. The email says, "Thank you for an unequaled spectacle that has become an indispensable tradition." Indispensable tradition says something about time. That some unequaled spectacle has over time become an indispensable tradition, an indispensable part of everyday work and everyday life. And this particular email was sent by the mayor of the Italian island Giglio to the cruise ship captain sailing a ship called Costa Concordia. And this is 6 months before Captain Schettino and his crew grounds outside of Giglio. This is this very island. So 6 months before, the mayor of this very island thanks not Schettino, but Schettino's colleague for an unequaled spectacle that has become an indispensable tradition. If we look at the transcripts from that day of actually grounding outside of Giglio, Captain Schettino was not up for it. He didn't want to make the flyby, which was now an indispensable tradition, of the flyby of Giglio. He was not up for it. But it was expected. His degrees of freedom were limited. And that will be our next point here in this presentation, to describe local rationality rather than one correct picture. What constrains and enables work? And in any accident analysis, we need to describe this. So again, let's go to the maritime world and let's go to Denmark. And I'm actually sitting in my home office in Malmö. So I'm almost looking out across the Öresund towards Copenhagen. And this accident that I will introduce you to now shortly is happened in these waters, the Drogden Channel, and it was analyzed by the Danish Maritime Accident Investigation Board. And the Danish Maritime Accident Investigation Board, looking at the participation list here for this webinar, there might actually be some members of it. They take a very interesting approach to the analysis of accidents, very much based on these assumptions that I have just laid out, and being highly dedicated to describing local rationality rather than the one objectively correct picture. And so this is the case of two vessels colliding in the narrow Drogden Channel in November of 2014. And rather than showing the correct picture of where they collided and how that happened, the Danish Maritime Accident Investigation Board actually gives us two pictures. They says, all right, this is the collision and how it happened from the perspective of this ship here, Kraslava. And to contrast that with this picture, which is the perspective of the Atlantic Lady, the ship with which Kraslava collided. Rather than giving us one true and correct picture, they say, let's look at how these two perceptions of reality interacted in a way that gave rise to this collision. And they conclude eloquently in their analysis, and this is a nice sort of picturing of a constrained environment of constrained degrees of freedom, where they say, during the approach to the entrance of the Drogden Channel, Atlantic Lady had to navigate around Drogden Lighthouse and turn into the channel. Such an approach to the channel has in the past proved to be challenging, which has been indicated by the frequent collisions with buoy number 16 and as shown in the navigation analysis made by the Danish Maritime Safety Administration in 2009. The main challenge here is that Drogden Lighthouse is in a position where northbound ships have to make large turning maneuvers in relatively strong currents before entering the channel. In restricted visibility, it will be inexpedient to lower the speed significantly, because the ship will be set to the northeast with a risk of colliding with a buoy or grounding. Furthermore, at a lower speed, steering will be significantly impaired on a large ship with a larger turning radius, thereby rendering it difficult to execute the turn in the Drogden Channel. They are describing the operative environment and the limited degrees of freedom and the inherent risks that we know of in that environment. And they basically acknowledge that this is risky waters to navigate in. As long as we have these conditions for work, risks are expected. And these collisions will be, if not usual, at least sort of expected parts of the variability of working in such an environment. And if we go ahead to the next point here in this presentation, is that what we need to do also in accident analysis based on our new assumptions is to make recommendations targeting the conditions under which people work, rather than targeting rule adherence or the writing of better rules or auditing. We now make recommendations targeting the very conditions under which people work. If we find an environment which is unfriendly to work within, then we try to change that environment. And in this very accident investigation, again, the Danish Maritime Accident Investigation Board makes an eloquent and beautiful little recommendation. They don't say, follow the rules better, be more vigilant, follow call regs. They say, no, the Danish Maritime Accident Authority, the Danish Maritime Authority has reported the following to the Danish Maritime Accident Investigation Board, that the marine accident report supports all the risk analysis that have reached the conclusion that safety of navigation could be improved considerably by removing Drogden Lighthouse. Change the conditions under which people work. Remove the lighthouse and you have a completely different operative environment with additional degrees of freedom and reduced risk in this risk landscape. The Danish Maritime Authority is striving to achieve this solution, but a final decision to remove the lighthouse requires clarification of economic issues. And if I'm not mistaken, the lighthouse is still very much there. It's a beautiful, old, nice lighthouse. And there are other goals involved here as well with why you would like to keep it and then navigate in recognized risky waters. Final point in this presentation for this lunch seminar is to analyze how people create safety every day. Don't limit your analysis of safety to accidents and incidents. Open up an analysis of how do people actually ensure safety every day? How are people a resource of safety rather than a problem of risk? Start mapping and asking, what challenges do people face in their day-to-day operative environments? What are the resources by which they cope with those challenges, and are there mismatches? Are there situations where there are no resources to cope with the challenges that they face? And in that case, what do we do? And in that case, what do the people do? Because they sometimes invent the resources by themselves. One of my favorite examples, which also shows a good example of an environment where I would never like to work, is a Swedish hospital where the emergency ward was completely overcrowded with patients lying in the corridor in beds. And at one point, there were no alarms left even to hand out to the patients. And what did the staff do to just make sure that the patients that were put in these beds could have some form of alarm function and say, my situation is deteriorating, come and watch me? They started to hand out pots and cutlery and just something for the patients to slam with. And that shows the adaptive capacities of these people, but it also shows that the resources that they have do not match the challenges that they face. That they still can invent the resources, but it shows an example of a really perverse environment to work in. And I would never want any of my loved ones to have to work in such an environment. But we need to keep those two thoughts in our head at the same time. The innovative nature and the adaptive capacities of humans working in these high-risk environments, but also our ethical duty to provide them the resources necessary to do their work. That's sort of it. I've outlined a different approach, one in which human error is an unnecessary term for the analysis of accidents. We don't even need to mention it in order to build an analysis opening up dimensions of time and space, describing local rationality rather than one correct picture, an analysis in which we make recommendations targeting the conditions under which people work. And I would encourage you to analyze how people create safety every day. Then we base our analysis on the assumptions of human error being a hindsight claim at best, of people doing what's locally rational to them at the time. At the time they do take actions, those actions are not errors. In that case, they wouldn't take those actions. The system is not inherently safe. It's kept safe by people's continuous adaptation strategies, even if that is to hand out pots and cutlery. And while people have agency, their degrees of freedom will always be limited. A good example of that is navigation in Drogden Channel, and this is then to try to establish a holistic approach to accident analysis. I'll end this presentation with a quote by the giant, I would say, in our field, which was a Dane, late Jens Rasmussen, who was working for the Risør Research Institute. He once said, supposedly in a lecture, he said, if people's behavior doesn't make sense to you, that says something about you. It says something about the perspective that you have taken. It doesn't say anything about them or their performance. And that, I think, is a good quote to end this lunch introduction to an alternative approach to accident analysis, one in which the notion of human error is actually unnecessary. Thank you so much. If you are interested in the activities that we do at Lund University, I encourage you to check out humanfactors.lth.se. You're always welcome, of course, to reach out to me over email, as long of messages as you like, or in very short messages on Twitter. Happy to interact with you, and thank you for joining this lunch.
Thank you so much, Johan. Really, really an interesting perspective you gave on human error and safety in general. I liked a lot the question that you encouraged all of us to ask, and I think even you can ask it in your organizations. You must not be necessarily at sea, but how do people create safety every day? It's safety is also in order to avoid doing errors, because no matter what you're doing, you will try not to do errors in your daily work. I'll just take down your share screen.
Sure, thank you.
I really like that one. I'll bring that one with me back. So I have one question. It's like if we imagine that there were no rules, that we would just rely on people's good feeling, do you think that would decrease in number of errors and accidents out there? If you just kept out the ISM code and all the safety in systems things that there are out there. Do you think that would help us?
No, not necessarily. But I think that you would need to ask those who are supposed to follow those rules, what rules that matter to them, what rules that they use as a resource.
Yeah.
Because that's what we ultimately want our rules and procedures to be, resources for action. No air traffic pilots would like to get rid of the before takeoff checklist, for instance, because that's a great resource to check that you've done everything, every memory item that you are supposed to have done. And I'm sure that you in the maritime sector have similar procedures and checklists, and you all appreciate those as resources to harness. But rules such as, for instance, call regs are probably quite useless in day-to-day operative work. They serve a different purpose than to facilitate work. So I think that you need to analyze what rules make sense to us in order to do the work.
Makes perfectly good sense, and I know also the ISM code and some of the codes that are used for sailing. They are so thick. So I mean, you wouldn't remember what's written in them, and it becomes just like that. An authority can say, okay, now we have given you all the things you must know and comply with, but it's not, no human would be able to comply with everything.
No, and they are not intended for that either. Those are sort of rituals of responsibilization, of saying you are now responsible, and we now have this language, this mean for holding you accountable. They don't serve the purpose of facilitating work.
Exactly. Very, very good explanation. Well, we have a question from Nana Tit. She's asking, can you say something very fast about the collaboration between sea and shore and safety, of course?
I would love to know more about it. I was involved in a nice little study of mooring, it's called, right? A couple of years ago, and there it was clear that a seemingly simple process actually involves interactions between shore and sea several days before the mooring action even takes place. So I think that is one of the necessary interactions that we need to see how safety and risk emerges from. And that will become ever more important by increased digitalization and increased system autonomy, where the tasks of onboard staff might be reduced, and we'll have system automation doing much more of the navigation and even taking decisions. Then that is one of those interaction interfaces that becomes ever so more important to study with regards to how safety and risk emerges. So make sure that you keep that interaction in your ongoing risk assessments, your dialogues about risk. How do you make sure that that shore-based staff gets to participate in and learn and know about the operations that go on offshore? Make sure that that's one of the most important, perhaps, lessons from various industries that I've been part of studying, is to make sure that people get to know each other's working environments. So when being introduced to an onshore job in this industry, make sure that as part of that introduction, you get to spend 2 months offshore to understand the work of those who you are supposed to interact with on a daily basis at one point in your work.
Makes sense. That's also why it's very important that seafarers, when they go shore, they will bring this knowledge with them. So very often, especially like in the safety departments, you'll see a lot of former seafarers working there. So I definitely think that happens. But then once you're off for some years, you start to forget a little bit. But of course, it's still better if it was me being in that department.
And I think it's more intricate than that. I don't think that you start forget things. I think you become socialized into a different role. And we see that in aviation as well. We have a master's thesis inbound soon that I'm supervising that is studying that within aviation, the interactions between sort of sharp end work in cockpits with their safety departments, in which we have pilots staffing the safety departments, but pilots who become socialized into a different role and thereby get a different perception of piloting. And that, I think, is an interesting process to study, and should be for you as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, makes sense. Well, we have one last question from Thomas Davis, and he says, thank you, JB. Aspiring as always. Any brief comments on applying a contemporary approach in a government agency, which is also tasked with enforcing the regulations, handing out fines, etc.? Can the two be combined?
Yeah.
Good question.
A beautiful question, Thomas, who was part of writing the Danish report that I introduced you to. Thank you for that. Yeah. Where there is power, there will be revolt. Where there is power, there will be resistance, I think, is what Foucault taught us. And I think that if we can introduce people into also these environments that start resisting a bit towards this task that they have been given, and also start appreciating how messy work is actually done, and rather try to then go to the operators whom they are surveilling and monitoring and auditing, and study them critically based on, again, how does the company view their employees. That's what I would like from these audit processes, and have in mind, how do you as a company configure your employees? What are their degrees of freedom? What challenges do they face? What are the resources that they use to cope with those challenges? Are there mismatches? Come with those questions also as a public agency, rather than to say, okay, so what is the procedural adherence here at the sharp end? Rather look at how do you as an organization facilitate or not any procedural adherence by your limiting or opening of degrees of freedom. That is a terribly tricky task, of course, and I've recently had a similar dialogue with our Swedish Civil Aviation Authority and all their inspectors, that how much of a tricky task that is when you are too constrained in the degrees of freedom as a public authority, in that case, based on the regulatory framework by which you are supposed to audit based on. But thank you, Thomas. It's a great question and a great challenge, but I think it's possible to take that challenge on.
One thing is for sure, we don't have to give up. I mean, we still have to think and do research and talk about it, because this is not something that one day we will say this is done deal. It will always be in the making, because then new systems, as you said, new technologies will make new opportunities for errors and so on. So this is an ongoing question that will never stop. So
if we believe that it's a done deal, then we are in really risky.
Good. So Johan, thank you so much for sharing your considerations, and for also drawing some parallels to the maritime world from your aviation world. It was very, very interesting to get your point of view on this very important topic. It is, after all, human lives that are on the plate for this discussion. So we don't want to lose any of these lives, but of course, we can neither have a completely zero error culture anywhere, because we are just, after all, humans. So thank you so much for sharing your thoughts again. Thank you to all of you out there for listening along. We have a YouTube channel where we are sharing the recordings of our TITBITs. So my colleague, she just put the link to that one here. So if you are hungry for more tidbits about everything at mellem himmel og jord, some as we say in Danish, you can just tune in there. And then we will be back tomorrow in the TITBIT studio with something completely different, or not at all. It's about the digital twins, a digitalization at shipyards and when you're building ships. So it's actually a little forum where you, or an online place where you can do all the errors, so you can avoid them when you're building the ship. So that's what is a digital twin. Yes, it will be explained a little bit more deep and better than I can do tomorrow. So tune in at 12. where Christian Schlette from SDU, he will be sharing his lunch and all his awesome knowledge about digitalization and digital twins. I think that sounds great. So see you tomorrow, and all of you have a wonderful day. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you for participating. Cheers.